So that, I mean, that is just, it's mind-boggling. And what it says to me, and I've often talked about this, is that on the general landscape, the average author worldwide, whether Asian or Western, fundamentally, I have to believe, wants to do what's right. But there's an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. And as people are bombarded with irresponsible activities, their tendency to listen to the devil versus listen to the angel and do what's wrong versus do what's right is an erosion that is ongoing and has been ongoing for now several years. And I worry personally, at Editage we do a lot of author services, we do a lot of education and good publication practices. We cannot educate fast enough to be able to prevent this erosion. I could talk about ICMG guidelines, I could talk about good publication practices, I could talk about a whole bunch of things about how an author should conduct themselves, and it's just going to go over their head, when in fact all they really need to do is get a paper in a high impact journal, and many of them have in their head, I'm a 1.5 impact factor, I'm a 3 impact factor, and that's what they look for. And so when they receive these emails, they are encouraged and they are stroked, and the devil is stroking their shoulder to entice them to go this way, and they are dragged in knowingly or unknowingly down this route. And this is the tragedy of the predatory and the corruptive practices that are taking place, is people's careers are being affected. And my point is that we cannot educate fast enough. We're at the turning point right now where these companies are becoming so sophisticated. The website that I showed and the one that Stephen showed, I mean, they put a lot of work into these websites. When I first saw the website on the paper mill that I showed in mine with the guy Phyllis, and Jeffrey Beal pointed out on his blog, it was a shock to me because that website was better in construction than any of the author services websites out there. They had a real-time phone and blah, 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 and that's why we really dug into them. Who are these people? And it turns out they have about 5 or 6 other websites that deal with high school and university term papers and other things. So they made a play for the publisher space and the professional authors in research, of which, thanks to Jeffrey, they no longer exist. So they were shamed out of existence, so they shut down. But that's the whack-a-mole that we're facing. You can shut down one company, and they're just going to come up the next day with another name and a whole other business model. So in the next session after the break, we're going to talk about how, as an industry, we can start to address these issues. So for right now, it's open floor question. We have about a little bit more than 15 minutes. We have lots of time for discussion. And one of the questions that came in on Slido was whether any particular fields attract more predatory or irresponsible journals than others, engineering, medicine, or physics. The only data I personally have is a slide that I presented from the Bjorn and Shen paper, where they did an analysis of Jeffrey Beal's list and just broke it out by sector. Many of these companies go where the money is, and the medical and engineering is where people who are authors tend to have the money or have a propensity to spend the money for author services. Open access may have, through APC charges, may have changed the chemistry of how authors pay for things, but I'm old enough to remember that I paid for page charges, I paid for color figures, I paid for all kinds of things. So authors have been paying for things for a long time. It's just now that the web is so pervasive that this element of trust in publication is being eroded. And that's the keystone to the issue, is for decades, hundreds of years, scholarly endeavor has been based upon trust. An academic looks to their colleagues, looks to industry, looks to vendors in a trustful manner. And in Asia, I would not expect, saving face, for you to fraud me. Why would I even suspect that you would fraud me? Because you should be saving face. And so they get sucked into these scams because of culture. And that's why a lot of it comes out of Pakistan, India, and other places, is specifically targeted at China, although there's a lot in the landscape of China. Another question is, if fake journals copy your text, won't that depress your Google results as well? And I don't know that issue, maybe.
Indeed. In fact, if you Google a lot of journals, you find that the top one that appears on top is a nomics journal, usually as the first one to appear in any Google search. So usually authors would go and click on that one. It tends to do that.
Yeah, certainly, from a vendor perspective, and eDance does it, we do it, the amount of effort we try and the money we spend on search engine optimization through Google, through keywords and linkages and other things to get high ranking, really high ranking, and consistently high ranking is an expensive endeavor with Google. That's how Google makes their money. But high ranking also comes from interconnectivity of cross connection. And if they can tap into it by stealing text, they may be able to layer onto that network and artificially raise their rank just by copying that text. And so it is a strategy. But I personally think they're not thinking that way. I personally think that they're just lazy in putting these things together. And there may be mills out there just creating websites of fraudulent activity. And if they are themselves English language challenged, they are copying the text simply because it's easier to take copied text that says what they want to say and not have to spend any time or effort to change it. Are there any, among the panelists, are there any curiosities or questions among yourself that you'd like to speak to?
Well, it's just going back to Google, I will say that we, especially in our Indian journals, we dissuade them from using Google Scholar as part of their metrics, citation metrics, when they report citation numbers on the individual article pages. It's very upsetting to editors, but we have to explain to them that we don't consider Google Scholar's citation metrics to be as valid because they include numbers from sources that we wouldn't consider credible.
So we've shown a lot of scary scenarios, and honestly, I'll tell you, it's just scratching the surface. We could dig down into layers of these types of things. Are there any horror stories from the audience that is known of, or are there any questions about what you've seen so far today?
I tried to use the service, but my question was too long, so it kicked me out.
Do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah. I'm Mike Walsh with the American Welding Society. We're also an SDO like IEEE. A horror story is we had one of our key structural codes for welding bridges illegally reproduced and sort of at the will of the authors changed in China. And an American company was building a bridge, and they had subcontracted several millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to a Chinese company who was using this unauthorized and not accurate code. And they were so far into the production process and the construction process that they got bad parts from China, and they ended up settling and working out a resolution with them that cost them several more $1 million because they were too deep into the project to cut them off and go elsewhere, and timelines and everything else were affected. So that's a real multi-million-dollar issue that happened in the last couple of years as a result of sort of unauthorized authoring of content. And I think you had mentioned the real victims are maybe the authors, but I think the real victims are the end users that use the science or the technology that come out of these articles. I have a friend who just went through several rounds of cancer, and thank God the doctors were using real knowledge to treat him because he survived, but I can imagine if it was bad technology. I want to mention that at the end of April, China enacted a law that restricts NGOs who are either in or wanting to go in and set up shop in China under the guise of protecting national security and ethical harmony. And I think what it's going to entail, and it has implications for education and research in addition to virtually every other business. It sounds to me like it could create a huge obstacle for professional scholarly publishing within China, but also it could also enable some of these services that you described as being an even bigger player. So if you're not aware of that law, do some research on it because it's impacting us and some of the strategic decisions we're making right now in terms of dealing with China.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up, and I'm sure Stephen would like to follow up with you after on that, because there's some initiatives in China that we're both involved with. China is actually turning the corner and taking some very ethically responsible steps to curbing the activity, and we'll talk about that in the second session. So it's not all bad. The problem is that the corruption on the landscape of independent individuals or companies working, it's a massive challenge, and anyway, it's pervasive, and it's a massive challenge. While you were talking, I thought of something, but it skipped out of my mind, so I'm going to ask if anybody else has some comments until I get that back into my proper slot there. The drugs are working against me.
A follow-up about some of the challenges we face at IEEE in identifying co-sponsors for our conferences. Once you leave our borders, North American borders, the definition of nonprofit or not-for-profit becomes kind of fuzzy. And our big challenge now is mostly concentrated in India in finding what we consider to be nonprofit scholarly organizations. There is a cottage industry of technical schools who are very eager. These are engineering schools that have sprung up in the last 5, 10, 15 years throughout India, who are very eager to partner with us on a conference in order to build their reputations. And we're having a lot of challenges sorting out the good ones from the not so good ones. And it's becoming a cottage industry with my department and others that work closely with us, just to make sure that we're finding the right partners, folks who want to run our conferences for the good of the engineering community and not just to make a buck. So we still have a long way to go.
Some of these people are very entrepreneurial, as was mentioned earlier, and smart entrepreneurial. They are driven financially to scam the system, and that's all they do, and that's all they want to do. I know Gordon had talked at previous panels that we'd been on about a Canadian scam conference that where an Asian person was leveraging, I guess, his Asian contacts and saying that there was these conferences in a hotel in, I don't know, in Canada somewhere. Maybe you can
Ottawa.
In Ottawa.
Yeah, so this gentleman was a professor at a Canadian university, and we had one of our sales folks noticed she had an alert set up for IEEE Explore, and she would get alerts when new conference proceedings came out, because she would be on the lookout for those for her clients. And she happened to notice one of our conferences. It was in Canada, and she just started scanning through the papers, and she noticed every single one of the authors had Chinese names. And she said, all right, that's probably okay, but could you guys just take a look? And so we started digging, and we found out that the hotel had no record of the conference having taken place. And to add insult to injury, there were a few papers submitted to the conference that were machine generated using a program called SciGen, which is it's used to prank conferences when you suspect that the peer review is a little shaky. So it's kind of computer science gobbledygook nonsense to an uneducated or to a reader who has no technical background. You could probably get through the first paragraph and think, okay, this is a boring engineering paper. But if you have the slightest familiarity with it, you know within a few sentences that you're reading nonsense. These papers were accepted, basically confirming to us that there was no peer review happening for that conference. So the conference itself was a ghost conference. Papers that were nonsensical were accepted into the program, and this conference organizer was really taking advantage of his countrymen, in my opinion, because he had emigrated from China, and he was going back and taking advantage of students who needed to get published in order to enrich himself. So he's no longer doing business with IEEE, I'm happy to say.
Some of the colorful language in Dr. Franco's emails that he had shown, this speaks again to Asian culture. In high context societies, the language of communication has all this fluff in it. And so again, while we look at these emails and we say, oh, this is a sheer giveaway, I can look at any of my Japanese colleagues' emails and say, sort of the same things. Where are these guys coming from? I don't need all this introductory fluff about their family and what's going on, but that's the way that business is done. And so clearly these emails are written by people who are typically targeting Asian audiences, and the templates are designed for typically targeting Asian audiences.
Yeah, I have a person who reports to me in Delhi, and they famously always refer to telephonic conversations. It's just the way that the language is spoken and written, and it's for somebody from that area, it wouldn't be that unusual.
Yeah, to avail
see
yourself to this, please
Yeah,
avail yourself.
Exactly.
Other questions or comments?
Don, can I just
Yeah,
follow up on the point about Google? In China, Google is blocked, so there's a local provider that carries out that service, a company called Baidu, a very, very large company called Baidu. And the example that I had within my presentation, if you search for Idans using Chinese characters, that company actually comes up top of the search as a paid advertisement. We've contacted Baidu about this. We've alerted them to the fact that this company is acting unethically and has been for a number of years. And the attitude from Baidu is, well, they're paying for the advert. So there's not only the difference in culture, with these unethical companies, but also the companies that are supposedly acting in an ethical manner, like Baidu. They essentially have a different set of standards to what we may be used to.
Other comments or questions? We're going to have the intermission within a few minutes, so yeah.
Just got a question that probably would be better, it might be better served in the next session. I was wondering whether these two international treaties that are currently being negotiated at the moment, one with Europe and one with the Pacific region, will have any impact from an intellectual property perspective on stamping down on these fake or dubious journals.
Thanks, because you also just prompted me to what I was thinking about earlier. With respect to intellectual property, my biggest fear, and I speak about this periodically, is that big data is just going to fuel the fraud industry. The paper mills will no longer have to plagiarize. They will no longer have to steal papers that are out there, because they can steal a fraction of a clinical trial, an arm of a hypertensive trial from a pharma company or whatever, and write the paper with that data, and that data has no fingerprint. We will not be able to trace where it comes from unless Merck or another company recognizes it. And these papers will be alongside the literature, in the case of a hypertensive trial, possibly in Lancet. And because it's only a snippet of data, the conclusions will come to another completely erroneous conclusion against the major clinical trial which was published, and then challenge the clinical trial, and then people will use the bogus paper to challenge the clinical trial, and we will get to a point, and we are at a point, where the papers are not going to be able to tell what right and wrong, and Jeffrey Beal again has pointed out cases where the New York Times, I think it was for Ebola in Africa, the New York Times had quoted a paper on epidemiology of Ebola, which was totally fraudulent as a paper. And the New York Times, the paper ended up being retracted. New York Times never retracted their story. Now this is mainstream research getting into mainstream science reporting. The science reporters don't do their homework anymore, and this is getting out to the masses as real and never retracted. And that's Jeffrey's peeved about the fact that New York Times they know it's a retracted paper, they never retracted their own article on the paper. So intellectual property is being stolen, and so whether there's going to be, through treaties or other higher government relationships, hopefully there is building awareness at the government level about these issues. Right now, it's a publisher challenge. It's a pharmaceutical challenge, it's a vendor challenge, and it's in this community, and we'll talk a bit later again with CRPR or other initiatives that are underway, what we're trying to do about it. But it's through these initiatives that we're trying to lobby government and tell them, hey, this is what's happening in the trenches. So it may be too early yet to rattle these chains of things that are actually ongoing, but I'm hoping at some government levels they're listening and aware.
Then may I add to that, or is
Yep.
you have time?
Yep.
To the point that the gentleman just asked, there is an initiative that's ongoing right now by the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE, which is a very important organization of medical journals. And there is a data sharing policy document that's now circulating that eventually is going to become the official policy for all medical journals, which states the following. For any clinical trial, and this is particularly, we're beginning with clinical trials. I'm a member also of the ICMJ. For any clinical trial, randomized controlled trial, which tests the advantages of a new treatment or a new intervention, something that would have an impact in medicine and public health in general, the authors of the paper submitting that would have to deposit in an accredited repository. It could be their university or it could be the journal itself, depending on which journal would want to maintain a database, the original raw data de-identified of the subjects, patients enrolled in that particular trial. So this has the very noble goal of eventually allowing the public out there to be able to revisit scientists, eventually to revisit the data, so that new angles, new discoveries will be able to be put in the public domain, placed in the public domain. However, this is also creating a huge problem, because anyone who has a bone to pick with the authors of a particular paper, or with company, with pharma, eventually will massage the data, do extensive data dredging, and eventually twist the results to their own logic. And a case in point is what's beginning to happen now. And if you folks Google vaccines right now, and vaccine, as you know, is a very contentious medical problem right now, because you have a whole field of community of anti-vaccine activists out there. So if you Google vaccines, most of the things that are going to appear are pseudoscientific organizations whose only purpose is to advance that vaccines are bad for you, and that something, an evil product of medicine that eventually is causing autism and all of those ills that you see associated with that. Well, one of the lovely things that the anti-vaccine activists are waiting for this policy to allow them is to have all of these pharmaceutical company data on vaccine trials to be in the public domain, so that it can actually revisit all the toxicity data, which has already been done. It's very scientifically sound principles controlled by FDA, by all the regulatory agencies out there, and eventually do all the cherry picking until they find something, torture the data enough when something significant is going to turn out, so they can advance their side of the message that vaccines are bad for your health. And that it suffices to have one of these papers published out there. The media is going to pick on the topic, and one of the major problems is that the media wants to give a balanced view on things. You know, they look at the side of science, and they look at the side of people who are challenging the science in a way of giving a balanced view. And that perception of balanced view is what eventually confuses everybody at the end.
Yeah. The media is definitely stirring the pot in these regards. So we have an intermission.